One man looked at the brutal Russian winter and thought, hey, you know what? I can beat that. Hi, I'm on the toilet, you're on your phone, so let's learn something interesting together. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with one of the largest armies the world had ever seen. At first, he probably felt pretty confident because it was Napoleon. The guy had been winning battles across Europe for ages. There was just one tiny problem. Russia is huge, and Russian winters are basically nature's way of saying, you should have just stayed home. As Napoleon's army pushed deeper into Russia, the Russians kept retreating and destroying supplies behind them, meaning the French army kept moving further and further away from their food and shelter. And then winter arrived. Soldiers froze, they starved, they got sick, horses died, supplies collapsed. And what started as one of the most powerful invasions in history slowly turned into an absolute disaster. By the time Napoleon retreated, his massive army had been devastated, which honestly makes this one of history's greatest examples of maybe don't invade Russia right before winter. Apparently, several world leaders needed to learn that lesson the hard way. An enemy left a giant wooden horse outside the city gates, and people thought, hey, you know what? Let's bring this thing inside. Which honestly feels like humanity ignoring every possible red flag at once. According to the ancient story of the Trojan War, the Greeks had spent years trying to capture the city of Troy, and eventually they appeared to just give up and sail away. But before leaving, they left behind a massive wooden horse, kind of as a gift. Now, personally, if an enemy army leaves me a mysterious giant wooden object after years of war, I am probably not wheeling that thing into my city. But the Trojans celebrated. They believed that they had won, and they dragged the horse inside the city walls. The problem? The Greek soldiers were secretly hiding inside of it. And during the night, they climbed out, opened the city gates, and Troy was attacked from inside. Which means one of history's most famous disasters basically happened because people looked at a suspicious giant horse and collectively decided, yeah, this seems fine. And honestly, that feels extremely human. One company had the chance to buy Netflix, and they said no. So welcome back to History from the Toilet. This is where history is short, simple, and sometimes painfully embarrassing in hindsight. In the year 2000, Netflix was still a small company, still mailing DVDs to people, which honestly already sounds ancient by now. But at the same time, Blockbuster was huge. They had thousands of stores, millions of customers, and basically controlled movie rentals. So Netflix approached Blockbuster with an offer. They wanted Blockbuster to buy them out for around $50 million. And Blockbuster executives reportedly laughed them out of the room because apparently they looked at streaming and thought, nah, people love late fees. But to be fair, at the time Blockbuster probably felt unstoppable. But while Blockbuster stuck to old business models, Netflix adapted to the future. Streaming exploded, and of course Blockbuster collapsed. And Netflix became one of the biggest entertainment companies on earth, which makes this one of history's greatest examples of maybe don't ignore obvious changes, especially when the future is literally sitting across the table asking you to buy it. A company helped invent the future and then completely refused to believe in it, which feels like the business version of shooting yourself in the foot. In 1975, an engineer at Kodak created one of the world's first digital cameras. Now today, that sounds revolutionary. But at the time, Kodak basically looked at this new technology and thought, yeah, let's not ruin film sales. And honestly, from their perspective, it made sense. Kodak absolutely dominated photography. Film cameras were everywhere. The company was just massive. There was one small problem. The future didn't give a shit. As digital cameras improved, consumer behavior completely changed. People stopped buying film. Phones eventually replaced cameras altogether, and while other companies adapted, Kodak struggled to catch up, which means one of the most famous photography companies on earth literally helped invent the technology that eventually destroyed its own business. And that might be one of the greatest examples of if you don't adapt, somebody else will. A military invasion once went so badly it became the textbook definition of, well, that was a terrible idea. So pull up a chair, grab your emotional support snack, and let's talk about history making questionable decisions again. In 1961, the United States backed a plan to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. The idea was to send Cuban exiles into the country and spark a massive uprising against the government. Now, on paper, maybe somebody thought this sounded completely brilliant. But there was one tiny problem. Reality exists. The invasion force landed at a place called the Bay of Pigs, and almost immediately things started to fall apart. The uprising they expected didn't happen. The invaders were heavily outnumbered. Air support problems created chaos, and Cuban forces quickly surrounded them, which meant the entire operation collapsed pretty quickly. And honestly, the whole thing became one of the most famous examples of overconfidence and terrible planning. Engineers once built a bridge that immediately started flopping around like a wet noodle. And honestly, that probably should have been everybody's first warning sign. In 1940, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge opened in Washington state. It looked modern, it looked impressive, and at first everything seemed completely fine. There was just one tiny problem. The bridge really did not like the wind. Even moderate breezes caused the entire structure to wobble dramatically. People started calling it the Galloping Gertie, which honestly sounds adorable for something that was very clearly trying to destroy itself. Drivers reported terrifying waves rolling across the bridge while cars were bouncing up and down. And instead of immediately going, hey, maybe this is something bad, people just kept trying to use it. Then, on November 7th, 1940, the bridge finally gave up. Winds caused the structure to twist violently until the entire thing collapsed into the water. And somehow one of history's most famous engineering disasters happened because humanity basically looked at a bridge shaking like spaghetti and thought, it's probably fine. France once spent an enormous amount of money building massive defenses to stop an invasion, and then Germany just simply went around them. Hi, I'm Chris. This is History from the Toilet. This is where history is short, simple, and sometimes feels painfully avoidable. After World War I, France wanted to make absolutely sure that Germany could never invade them again, which I guess is understandable. So France built an enormous line of defenses called the Maginot Line. We're talking fortresses, bunkers, underground rail systems, massive guns, basically the do not enter sign of military engineering. The idea was simple. If Germany attacks again, these defenses will stop them. But there was one problem. The line didn't fully extend through Belgium. And in World War II, Germany just kind of went around it. Which feels like spending years building the world's strongest front door while leaving the side window open. French defenses that were supposed to stop another invasion suddenly became completely irrelevant. And the Maginot Line became one of history's most famous examples of preparing perfectly for the last war instead of the next one. The Titanic received multiple iceberg warnings and just kept going, which kind of feels like a historical version of ignoring every single check engine light on your dashboard. When the Titanic set sail in 1912, it was considered one of the most advanced ships ever built. Some people called it unsinkable. And honestly, humanity should probably stop saying things like that out loud. During the voyage, nearby ships sent several warnings about dangerous ice ahead in the North Atlantic. Messages came in reporting icebergs that were directly in the Titanic's path, but the ship continued moving at high speed through the area. And eventually, Lookout spotted an iceberg way too late. The crew tried turning the ship, but there wasn't enough time. The Titanic struck the iceberg and began taking on water, and what followed became one of the most famous disasters in history. Which makes the whole story feel even more tragic when you realize that the warnings were there. A military unit once charged directly into enemy cannon fire because of a misunderstanding. And honestly, at several points, somebody probably should have yelled, "Wait, what?" During the Crimean War in 1854, British commanders sent an order during a chaotic battle known as the Charge of the Light Brigade. The problem? The order was very confusing, and somehow that confusion turned into cavalry soldiers charging straight towards heavily defended Russian artillery, which is basically the military version of, are we sure this is really the plan? The soldiers rode directly into massive cannon fire from multiple directions. It was incredibly dangerous, incredibly costly, and became one of the most famous military disasters in British history. Which makes the story even crazier is that the soldiers themselves were incredibly brave. The problem wasn't courage, the problem was leadership and communication completely falling apart. Which proves one important lesson. Bad instructions can turn even the best plans into absolute chaos. The CIA once considered using an exploding cigar in an assassination plot, and honestly, this story sounds less like real history and more like a rejected cartoon script. During the Cold War, the United States became heavily focused on removing Cuban leader Fidel Castro from power. And over time, some absolutely bizarre assassination ideas started appearing. We're talking about exploding cigars, poisoned scuba gear, even attempts involving contaminated personal items. Which honestly feels like somebody looked at James Bond movie and said, yeah, let's make that our strategy. Now, not every bizarre plan was actually carried out, but many of the ideas became famous because of how unbelievably ridiculous they sounded. And somehow, instead of making the CIA look intimidating, some of these plots made the entire situation feel weirdly cartoonish. Because at a certain point, humanity crossed the line from serious covert operation into Saturday morning supervillain energy. One wrong turn by a driver helped change world history forever. So pull up a chair, grab your snack, and let's talk about humanity accidentally creating absolute chaos again. In 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was visiting Sarajevo. Now, tensions in Europe were already extremely high at the time, and several assassins were waiting along his route hoping to kill him. So at first, the assassination attempt actually failed, which honestly should have been the end of the story. But later that day, Franz Ferdinand's driver accidentally took a wrong turn through the city. And, unbelievably, the car stopped near one of the assassins who had failed earlier. The assassin suddenly found himself standing just a few feet away from the Archduke by complete chance. And this time, the attack succeeded. What happened next triggered a chain reaction of alliances, declarations of war, and escalating conflict that eventually exploded into World War I, which means one of the deadliest wars in human history was partly connected to terrible timing, bad luck, and somebody making a wrong turn. Humanity really is unbelievable sometimes. A town once became so paranoid, people started accusing each other of witchcraft. In 1692, in Salem, Massachusetts, fear and hysteria began spreading through the community after several young girls started behaving kind of weird. People searched desperately for explanations. And instead of saying, maybe we should calm down and investigate carefully, the town basically went, yep, it's witches. Accusations spread fast. Neighbors accused neighbors. Families turned against each other, and fear completely took over the community. Some people were arrested simply because somebody claimed they were involved in witchcraft, which feels like one giant hysterical example of humanity panicking itself into chaos. Eventually, the hysteria faded, and many people later admitted that the trials had been a terrible mistake. But by then, the damage had already been done. And the Salem witch trials became one of history's most famous examples of what happens when fear completely overwhelms logic, which is a lesson humanity still needs to learn sometimes.